Bom dia a todas, todos e todes. Meu nome é Cecília, eu sou uma mulher branca, estou de cabelo solto, cabelo castanho claro, com uma blusa estampada e estou com um fundo de uma parede branca atrás de mim. O Baum Movens, grupo de estudos e pesquisas em condições de trabalho no turismo, vinculado ao Centro de Excelência em Turismo, SET, da Universidade de Brasília, UNB, e a Universidade Federal do Tocantins, UFT, tem a honra de recebê-los para acompanhar a terceira edição do seminário virtual Perspectivas Críticas sobre o Trabalho no Turismo, cujo tema é O Futuro do Trabalho no Turismo. Nesta edição, o objetivo é refletir sobre as tendências do futuro do trabalho no segmento, tendo em vista os avanços tecnológicos 4.0 e o contexto de desregulamentação das relações trabalhistas. Informamos que, infelizmente, não teremos tradutor de Libras no evento, da indisponibilidade de profissionais habilitados. Solicitamos ainda que, caso haja algum participante com necessidade de audiodescrição, por favor, indique aqui no chat. A atividade, então, que a gente vai começar agora é a atividade que deveria ter acontecido ontem, né, com o professor Tom Baum, cujo título é O Futuro do Trabalho Sustentável no Turismo, um título, inclusive, que o professor propôs, né, a partir do que a gente mandou para ele, com as informações que a gente mandou para ele sobre o evento. Ontem, infelizmente, teve esse problema técnico, mas a gente conseguiu remarcar para hoje já, então a gente está bem feliz com isso. Me apresentar, né? Eu sou bacharel em turismo pela UFOP, estou vendo que o centro acadêmico está presente, e mestre em turismo pela UFPR. E também estou como professora do curso de turismo da Federal do Tocantins, no campus da cidade de Arraias. Então, a gente vai ter agora a conferência com o professor Tom Baum, que é professor da Universidade de Strathclyde, na Escócia. Ele atua no Departamento de Trabalho, Emprego e Organização. Já foi também diretor do Departamento de Hospitalidade e Turismo. Tem mais de 35 anos de estudo e pesquisa com foco na força de trabalho do turismo. Já trabalhou em mais de 45 países como professor e também como consultor para governos e agências internacionais, inclusive a Organização Internacional do Trabalho. Here he is. Eu vou começar a falar em inglês agora, mas a gente tem aqui no chat o Lucas, que vai estar traduzindo, assim, na medida do possível, as falas do professor, então é possível acompanhar pelo chat, ok? E a gente também já mandou para vocês o conteúdo dos slides em português, né? So, Professor Tom Baum, on behalf of our research group, Movens, I am honored to welcome you to the third edition of the virtual seminar, Critical Perspectives on Work in Tourism. I remember when I started my studies about work in tourism during the master's degree, one of the first and most influential papers I read was International Perspectives on Women and Work in Hotels, Catering, and Tourism. And that paper was published by you with the International Labour Organization. After that, I've read so many others published by you, and I know there are many people here this morning and also people who are going to watch this lecture later who have also read many papers from you, and that makes this lecture very special. So, enough from me. We're now going to listen to you, Professor Tom.
Okay, thank you very much, Cecilia. And good morning to everybody. And my thanks to the organizers of the seminar for inviting me to join you for what sounds like a really exciting program. And I just wish I had the Portuguese to be able to participate more fully. But if this was in German, no problem. But unfortunately, my Portuguese is severely lacking. So my apologies for that. But I hope that we can share ideas, and that through my presentation and through the discussion, we can at least start something that is, or at least allow me to contribute to your debate and your discussion in a useful way. So can I start sharing my slides, Cecilia? Brilliant.
Yes, you can. I'm going to remove myself. You feel free.
Okay. I have to say I'm unfamiliar with this system, so you'll have to bear with me a little bit. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about.
Okay, no problem.
Okay. No. I will manage. Yes, don't worry about that. I am going to be talking about the future of sustainable work in tourism. And when I was discussing the original proposal for this seminar, for this contribution to your seminar, I added the word sustainable because I think there's a lot of discussion about the future of work in tourism. And if we are to come up with real solutions and real change in the nature of tourism work, we have to add in that word sustainable. We have to make the future look in a way that is very different from today. And visioning what the future might be, visioning where the future will be in terms of tourism employment, always brings me certainly back to this work sustainable. But I need to start really by apologizing about yesterday, because there was a total miscommunication. Maybe it's my head, my mind that got the dates mixed up, and I had it in my mind. I had it fixed in my mind. I didn't have it in my diary. This is what worries me very much. But I was fixed in my mind that it was on Friday that I was speaking with you. And all I can do is sort of hold my hands up and apologize, and hope I did not inconvenience people too much. Just a little bit about me before I start talking about this sort of the future of work. I've been lucky enough to work in this field, in the sort of field of critical studies in tourism employment, becoming more critical as I've got older, interestingly, for many years. And I've worked as an academic, but I've also worked for an extended period of time in public service, and working for government agencies, working on the planning and if you like, the research that underpins policy related to tourism employment. And then since becoming an academic, I've worked as a consultant, a researcher, and a teacher, both in my home country, but also internationally, working in maybe about 40 to 50 different countries in various ways. Unfortunately, never in Brazil. I've had Brazilian students, brilliant Brazilian students, some of whom are part of your academic community, but I've never actually had the pleasure of working in your country, which is a big hole in my academic profile. I'm particularly interested in, if you like, the social context of work, and trying to understand why work is the way it is in tourism. And in recent years, particularly since the pandemic, and this is interesting that your own movement is a child in many respects of the pandemic, but since the pandemic, we, myself and some colleagues in Strathclyde, have been working as part of a growing network of international scholars looking at tourism work, particularly hospitality sector work, through a critical lens. And I see what really excites me about this opportunity of contacting, communicating with you as colleagues, is that we're constantly looking to extend the international, if you like, scope, the spread of our communications and our links and our collaboration. And hopefully one of the outcomes of this conversation today will be to start that conversation. As I said, currently we have a very strong network with researchers in Norway, in Sweden, in Greece, in Italy, but also in Australia, in New Zealand, in the United States, in Canada, and also in Hong Kong and India, among other countries. And we're looking at ways in which we can look at common issues, common themes in different national contexts, and understand what are the cultural, what are the social, what are the wider sort of economic and political drivers that shape the way that work in the tourism industry takes place. Not always trying to find solutions, because I think much research in our field over the years has been managerial and problem solving orientated, and it's been entirely unsuccessful in my view. But I think we need to understand and to perhaps look to drive change in the way that the industry, the tourism industry, views work and its workers. And I think that is very much the thinking behind our collaboration. Anyway, coming back to my topic, I suppose the challenge is, where do I start? It is such a big topic. It's such a big theme that it presents many challenges in just trying to conceptualize, in trying to understand what we even mean by tourism work. At one level, that sounds a very silly thing to say. We all know what tourism work is, but do we really? And I'll come back to that in a little bit. So when we talk about sustainable work, when we talk about a future, so the future of sustainable work in tourism, are we talking about green practices? Are we talking about environmental good practice and how that impacts on the workforce? Are we talking about corporate social responsibility, CSR? Are we talking about something that just makes good business sense? Are we talking about ethical management practice? Are we just talking about a marketing gimmick? In a paper that we wrote recently, we talked about the idea of social washing, where ethical behavior by management in relation to their employees is often there for good marketing purposes. As I said, we described it in our paper as social washing, a bit like greenwashing in the environmental space. Are we talking about human rights? It's an area that certainly overlaps with human rights considerations. Are we talking about decent work and more? So we're talking about potentially a lot of different themes which link together and which overlap. Locating this notion of sustainability in tourism work, there's a number of drivers or a number of links that we call upon. I suppose the obvious one is the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, where Article 8 talks about full and productive employment and decent work for all. And in many ways, that's a very positive description, and it's a very aspirant, a very aspiring description of what sustainable work should look like in many respects. Decent work is something which we'll come back to now. Unfortunately, with Article 8 also talks about economic growth, and in my eyes, it's unfortunate that it is tied to, if you like, a capitalist paradigm of constant growth, which I don't think necessarily is part of achieving decent work. And I think the two are slightly confusing or when they're brought together. But anyway, insofar as it talks about work, it's talking about this notion about full and productive employment. And does, for example, the gig, the sharing economy offer that really in the way that most of us would like? And decent work, working conditions. We also need to call on ideas of sustainable tourism, tourism that takes full account of its current and future economic, social, and environmental impacts, addressing the needs of visitors, the industry, the environment, and my emphasis, host communities. In a sense, that definition of sustainable tourism from the United Nations World Tourism Organization is the one that's most widely used. And I don't think it really does justice to the people who work in the industry. It talks about host communities, but it's much more. It's a concept, sustainable tourism, which in my view has been hijacked by the environmentalists. And I'm not in any sense criticizing, if you like, the green agenda, but people are important within this context as well, and work is important. And I think most discussions of sustainable tourism, and indeed most publications on sustainable tourism, really neglect the workforce. And I think that is a huge gap, which some of us have started to address in our writing, but which really the leading agencies like UNWTO really haven't grasped. Decent work comes from the International Labour Organization, and I think this is quite a mouthful of a definition. Decent work sums up the aspirations of people in their working lives, and I like that because it immediately takes, if you like, the framing of decent work right down to the people who work in the industry. And that's something which often is neglected in discussions. A lot of discussion about work in tourism is generated but from an employer and government perspective. It doesn't really take into account how the people in the industry view the world. It involves opportunities for work that is productive and delivers a fair income, security in the workplace, and social protection for families, better prospects for personal development and social integration, freedom for people to express their concerns, organize and participate in the decisions that affect their lives, and organize through organized labor organizations and the like, I would say, and equality and opportunity and treatment for all men and women without regard to age, to ethnicity, to race or other criteria. And I think that's hugely important here. So it's a good start in many respects here that we see in this notion of decent work. And then we get an emergent concept, which you may or may not be familiar with, which is the idea of sustainable human resource management. Now, I don't particularly like human resource management as a term. I prefer perhaps people management or something like that. But anyway, the adoption of human resource management strategies and practices that enable the achievement of financial, social, and ecological goals with an impact inside and outside of the organization and over a long-term horizon. And for me, that's critical. And Ina Aust, as she is now, is, if you like, the leading voice in this field. And I think that's very important. It's bringing this notion of sustainability into the discussion, which is, for me, hugely important when we think about the people of management and the management of people in an industry that is hugely precarious and that is very unstable in terms of the opportunities it frequently it offers its workforce. But I think we need to come back to this notion of what is tourism work. And tourism work is hugely diverse. And that's one of its challenges. We talk about working in the tourism industry, and we look at data, we look at statistics. And I've spent quite a lot of time recently looking at official statistics relating to tourism employment in a number of countries, and issues around definition, issues about the if you like, the conflating of data relating to work in this sector, whether it's part-time, whether it's full-time, whether it's seasonal, or and in what sort of area it is, whether it's exclusively in tourism or whether it overlaps with other sectors, all create huge problems. But we also are a hugely diverse industry in the people who work in the industry. A lot of young people, but also people from hugely different backgrounds, people with disability, working in a multitude and a variety of different subsectors, doing very different jobs. Data-wise, I mean, I'm unfortunately, I'm not familiar with, if you like, the fine print, the detail of the tourism industry in Brazil. But I think data-wise, the UK government, for example, identified that work in the tourism sector consists of about 47% of what they call elementary, simple occupations. Now, I think that's a dreadful term, but it, if you like, it suggests that the balance of work is very much at the lower skills, lower qualifications end. And the consequences are that it's generally, in most countries, a relatively low paid industry with tough working conditions and the like. And it also is an industry which merges at its boundaries with images which are particularly challenging when we think of tourism employment. And the obvious one, although there are other boundaries which it touches on, the obvious area is around, for example, areas like child sex tourism, and, if you like, the really dark side of tourism work. But there's a lot, even going back to my earlier slide here, there's a lot about work that is tough, that is in many ways degrading, some of the cleaning work that our colleagues in the industry do, and the pressure that they work in. At the same time, there is exciting, glamorous, high-profile work at the same time. So it's an industry of contradictions in terms of the work that we're talking about. It's also, and I'm not expecting you to look in detail at this slide, but it's got attributes which are, in a sense, challenging. And I've talked about, this is what we know about the industry. Donald Rumsfeld, the former American, was he Secretary of State, talked about known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And the known knowns, what we know about tourism, is that the work is precarious, it's insecure, it's low wage, it offers infrequently antisocial working hours, it's perceived to be low skilled, there's limited workplace organization in many countries, trade unions are relatively poorly represented, there's blurred boundaries with other sectors, whether it's retail, whether it's the sex industry, whether it's all sorts of other areas. It's geographically dispersed between urban and rural. There are issues of health and safety. There's issues of what you might call, there are issues in terms of diversity. Women are overrepresented in the industry worldwide. Young people are overrepresented. People from marginal minority communities generally are overrepresented. It's an industry where we see harassment, bullying, sexual abuse, all sorts of things are present in this industry at a higher level than is the case in other sectors. So we're an industry with huge challenges in that sense. And just looking, as I say, I've been lucky enough to work alongside this industry for many years, and we have seen change. We've seen some clear evidence of improvement in some employment contexts, but at the same time, we must remember this diversity in the industry includes a reality of large multinational organizations, some of whom are quite good employers, but also a lot of very small micro businesses, both within the formal and the informal sector. And I think that's important because it's an industry which in many countries, and I'm sure that's the case in some of your touristic areas in Brazil, that there is a huge informal economy in tourism, which is unregulated, which is unrecorded in many respects, and where employment is maybe good, but it is also likely to be very challenging. We've seen huge growth in the industry across all areas, notwithstanding COVID-19, Corona. And there is a perception, interestingly, talking about the impact of the pandemic, there's a perception that the industry can return to its old models of operating and its own old ways of engaging with its workforce. I don't think that is the case. We've seen the emergence of lower cost budget models of operation, often using the thematic that you're working on in the seminar, technology, artificial intelligence, as a way of perhaps reducing human contact, customer contact in operation, but also reducing costs and reducing labor costs. And I think therein lies a problem. We've seen consolidation. We've seen new forms of contractual relationships. In organizations. We have in what we call in the UK 0-hour contracts, where people are contracted for no hours per week, but are available on demand to their employers. We've seen a growth of agency work, the growth of technology in terms of processing, in terms of de-skilling, in terms of communication and control, in terms of service. I was in a restaurant recently in Asia where there was literally no human contact in terms of your ordering via a QR code and delivery via a robot. So we had no contact with people during our meal. The emergence of the gig and sharing economy and all that goes with that in terms of precarious contracts and precarious lifestyle, a way of working in other ways, the growth of lifestyle employment drivers. And I think we've seen this with what the Americans call the Great Resignation post-pandemic, but also in a wider sense, that people are much more conscious of what they want from life. If they have the economic options to choose between tourism and other sectors, they are looking at what that means for their non-working lives as well as their working lives. So growth in consumer power over pricing, the growth of experience reviews determining what people choose to do. But also a growing sense of consumer entitlement, leading to abuse, to harassment, and other forms of issues. And the impact of crises, certainly the financial crisis 14 years ago impacted on the tourism industry and its workforce. Our current health crisis, which we're not really through, has had an unprecedented impact on work, perceptions of work, etc. And changing protection schemes, the different roles of political processes on work, and I'm increasingly interested in that. We see the impact of Brexit here in the UK on workers' rights, and what that will mean for tourism is important. Australia's just been through a change of government, and we've seen a radical change in terms of employment and legislation, employment law, all of which will impact on tourism. And we've seen cyclical processes, but we've also seen dramatic change in direction in terms of how work operates. We're seeing changes in, if you like, we talked a few years ago about the globalization of the workforce. Well, we're seeing in many ways currently the deglobalization of the workforce for a variety of reasons, through Trumpism in the United States, through Brexit in the UK, for example. So there's a lot been going on. So we're not in a static environment, and I think that's important as well. And coming back to Donald Rumsfeld, what we're also seeing are new things coming out of the pandemic. We see, but also underpinning change in many countries. Where I come from in the global north, demographic change, our aging population, is a known unknown in a sense. We know about it, but we don't really understand the implications. We're only post-pandemic starting to see those implications in the fact that there are less people available to work in the industry, less young people particularly. The question marks about the globalization of labor markets and how fluid labor markets are in terms of areas of work like tourism, growth in competing sectors in the labor market, for example, again in the global north, the growth of the care sector, looking after the old people is becoming a huge industry and is competing directly with tourism for a lot of its workforce. Impact of technology, the de-skilling effect of a growth in technology, and therefore further reducing the value of work in the sector, the gig economy, and also sort of structural labour market impacts of crisis, the way in which in many countries the pandemic has changed a lot of the rules around tourism work and has changed the way that a lot of people view tourism work. And I think that's an ongoing agenda which will affect the future. Just saying that the pandemic is over will not change things fundamentally. It'll only be in 10, 15 years' time that we'll really be able to evaluate the impact from a critical perspective of the pandemic on work, working conditions, and indeed the worker in tourism. So look at, in many ways, what we face now, and this is where this, if you like, the shift to a more sustainable approach is critical, is really in terms of the labour market impact of crisis that we have seen, and the question whether COVID has fundamentally altered attitudes to and expectations of work. Writing in the early days of the pandemic, writing in 2020 when the whole thing had only really just kicked off in our countries, I worked with two colleagues in Australia and one in New Zealand to assess whether what we were seeing in terms of the early impact of COVID on hospitality and tourism work, whether that signaled a fundamental and radical change, or whether it was what we called an amplification of the norm. And at that stage, we assessed, or we took the view that what we were seeing was not fundamentally new, but it was just was louder and it was clearer. Precarious, unstable work, insecurity in the workplace, etc. That they weren't new, But I think subsequently I would reevaluate our conclusions there and recognize a fundamental change in not just in tourism, but in attitudes to work generally. Certainly where I come from, people are looking at work choices in a different way, and they're making different life decisions around work than they might have done before the pandemic. Again, it's unclear to know and to really understand where that is going. What we're seeing is a flight from many of our larger cities, people moving out to perhaps live in a more flexible way away from large cities. And what does that mean for tourism, which tends to be concentrated in certain areas? We're seeing the sort of traditional, what I would in Marxist terms would be known as, if you like, a reserve army. Reserve army sources of labor, students, working holiday visa holders, migrant workers, the like. Will they return to the countries where they worked previously? I think that's very doubtful, and I don't know whether in a sense, this dependence on a reserve army, which the industry has depended on for a long time, in a sense, has actually been doing work any favors in our sector. In a sense, having access to cheap labor from elsewhere has acted as a barrier to employers actually improving conditions, improving work. So there's a lot going on as a consequence of the crisis, which has, if you like, changed the nature of the discussion about the future of work in tourism fundamentally from where it might have been 3 years ago. So coming back to this notion of sustainability, as I say, decent work and economic growth, number 8, is the one I focus on. But in a sense, there's a number of them here: gender equality, which impact on tourism work or linked to tourism work. Zero hunger links to tourism work in many parts of the world. So there's a lot going on within the 17 goals that relate to what we're talking about. But I think we need to start exploring what these mean in practice, and that's what I'm going to do in the last few minutes of my presentation this morning. Coming back to decent work, productive work for women and men in conditions of freedom, equity, security, and human dignity. And decent work is very laudable. It's a very praiseworthy notion. But is this an absolute or relative concept? Does decent work mean the same things across all countries? Does it mean the same to you in Brazil as it does to me here in Scotland? Does it mean the same in all cultural contexts in terms of, for example, gender opportunity? If you look at many countries of the world where women are hugely disadvantaged in the workforce, not least in my own, how does this look in different contexts? And is there any way in which we can put value and measurable indicators against dimensions of decent work? How do we decide whether conditions of freedom are more important than conditions of equity, security, human dignity? How do we get a usable a mechanism out of this notion? And I think that is that while what the United Nations, what the International Labour Organization look for, espouse, is hugely commendable. In practice, it's very, very, very difficult to try to understand how we can actually ensure that decent work takes place in reality. Here in Scotland, we talk about fair work, and we have a government-sponsored agency called the Fair Work Convention, which calls upon employers to operate to certain conditions And at the moment, we're going through a process to try to establish what fair work means in terms of the hospitality, not the wider tourism, the hospitality sector. And it's a really interesting process. I'm lucky enough to be the academic advisor to that process. And it's really interesting to see people from different stakeholder positions contribute to that discussion. So in a sense, locating tourism, that shouldn't read hospitality, it should read tourism. We need to obviously start with the original 3 pillars of sustainability. We need to recognize that we're talking about a model of employment that is located within the social pillar of sustainability. We can extend that. There are definitions of sustainability which talk about people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. Again, I think I would like to see a greater emphasis of work within all certainly the first 3 here. Then work and employment are implied, but they're not directly addressed within these definitions of sustainability. So I think we need to ask difficult questions. I think we need, as critical scholars, to be willing to ask difficult questions about the nature of work in the sector. And when I think about this, I go back to the iconic writing of the English social commentator George Orwell, whose work you might have heard of. Books like Animal Farm and 1984 are certainly well translated, but he also wrote a book based on the Great Depression in the 1930s called Down and Out in Paris and London, which I hugely commend to anybody interested in following this up. And one of the workplaces where he gained his experience was working as a plongeur or a pot washer in some of the leading hotels and restaurants in Paris in the early 1930s. And he asked something which I think is hugely important in relation to all of the work that we're talking about under tourism employment. He talked about the plongeur, but in many ways we can see this as a proxy for wider tourism work. He talked about his work as being servile and without art. He is paid just enough to keep him alive. His only holiday is the sack. Except by a lucky chance, he has no escape from his life, save into prison. It's a very depressing notion, but I think asking about what he also asks about the social purpose of such work. What good does it do to humanity? What is it actually contributing? And in some respects, we have to ask some of these questions about the work that we're talking about. Yes, it may contribute to the wider economic the wider economic development and support of cities, of communities, of resort areas. But at the same time, it's work which intrinsically, in sort of classical terms, has relatively little value. So sustainability as a way forward. A sustainable workforce is one where the work environment is caring and supports employee well-being, something which tourism work is not noted for. Employees are not seen as primarily resources that can be deployed and depleted to serve employers' economic ends. Their skills, talent, and energies are not overused or over-depleted. They are not faced with excessive workload, nor a relentless pace of work for weeks or years on end. During times of crisis, employees are given time to recover or seek the extra resources they need to perform in the future. Burnout is avoided and workers are given time for renewal. The first 2/3 of this is phrased in the negative format, and I think for me that's slightly frustrating. We need to be much more positive about a sustainable approach in the future to work. We shouldn't say just what it is not. We should be directly saying what it is. And this is what we've tried to do in some of our recent definitions, our recent visions, if you like, of a sustainable workforce in tourism, in something we've just written as a sort of an editorial for a special edition of a journal, the Journal of Sustainable Tourism. We talked about a sustainable workforce as composed of individuals who are available or engaged in work that provide dignity, another very important word in this conversation, recognition and fair reward, a reward of at least a living wage in a fiscally responsible enterprise whose operations, supply chains, and local ecological footprint exceed global ethical standards, audited yearly by independent agencies. Partnerships between employees and employers, unions and state agencies foster alliances across sectors and professions, education systems, commercial and non-for-profit organisation, with the aim of maintaining stable governance and an internal labour market that evens out over or underemployment of individuals between regions and urban centres. Inclusion, equity of opportunity and diversity policies and practices at a macro policy, meso organisation, micro individual level reduces traditional divisions within and between societies and industries to reduce conflict and promote peaceful collaboration nationally and internationally. There is a lot in that, I acknowledge, but it's worth, I think, unpicking that and looking at it critically. You may not agree with all parts of it. You may say that some parts are unrealistic. You may see gaps in it. But looking at it and thinking about your own world where you live and work, and the tourism industry that as you understand it, and testing it out. And we'd certainly be delighted to hear feedback on this, because this is a sort of the starting point of a discussion we're hoping to extend and elaborate on in the future. So, as I noted in that definition, we look at sustainable human resource management at three levels. We look at it from the point of view of the actions of the individuals and how they relate to organizations, their employers. We look at what we call the meso level, which is in a sense linked to parts of society, groups and organizations, our employers, the businesses we're talking about, and then we're talking about society as a whole, the political, economic, social factors, cultural factors, which drive how, for example, specific groups within the workforce are perceived, women, minorities, etc. So I think we need, when we're thinking about the future of work in our sector, to think about it at a macro level, at a meso level, at a micro level, because they interrelate, they're linked together, but at the same time, there are very distinct and differing factors at work here as well. So sustainable human resource management covers long-term conceptual and practical approaches and activities aimed at socially responsible and economically appropriate HRM, management of people. Sustainable HRM can be used for organizational planning and change situations and can help in sustaining employee dignity in times of retrenchment. I think we have to accept that there are economic cycles that go up and down, but how an employer handles the tough times is a far better indicator of a good employer than how, if you like, they cope with the good times when things are perhaps less, or decisions are less significant in terms of their impact. Long-term orientated, I've already said this. In terms of thinking about the long-term consequences of employment decisions right across the board. And for me, sustainable HRM it generally focuses on rights and responsibilities of of individuals in the workplace, putting in place practices that get the best out of employees over time, treats them with dignity, encourages them to stay, but to go further. I think the thing I've added to different definitions myself is a sense of giving employees agency over their working lives. Rather than telling employees what they are always going to be doing, to actually engage them in a conversation which allows them to input into how they see work, that they see their role within your organization. I'm a great believer in trying to fit the workplace to the needs and the requirements of people who aspire and look to work in the organization, rather than doing the reverse, which we traditionally do, which is saying to the employee, here's the job, you fit into it. You may not like it, but this is what we need you to do. I think it's turning that particular conversation upside down, developing mutually beneficial and regenerative relationships between internal and external resource providers, involving thinking about families, thinking about communities, thinking about the links to wider ecosystems, whether it's housing and accommodation, whether it's education, whether it's the natural environment. Tourism employment does not exist in isolation of all these factors. So the key components of a sustainable HRM for me are not the important thing. They're in a sense, they're obvious. And AirNet's list here really doesn't tell us anything new in terms of what good working practice should be. For me, it's a mindset. It's a way of looking at people in terms of work. It's looking at them as in terms of a relationship which is mutually beneficial. The organization benefits from having you working for them. You benefit from working for that organization. It's reciprocity is the word I would use here. And in practice, it means looking at the future and to a long-term relationship, but not necessarily only a long-term relationship. We need to accept that relationships do move on, and that some people may be able to give you huge value as employees, or an employer may be able to give you huge value in terms of your learning, but that relationship doesn't need to necessarily go on for the rest of our lives. I think there is a very good argument that some relationships in tourism work can be like a very passionate holiday romance, where you meet somebody on the beach and you build up a relationship over a short period of time, which has all the passion and energy that you're looking for. But you both know that at the end of that period, when you're on vacation, you'll both go your own direction, and the relationship will end. You've both got a lot out of it, and you don't go in tears, you go with a big smile on your face. And I think working relationships need to accept that those will take place, particularly in our industry. We need to invest in meeting the needs of both businesses and the individual. We need to recognize people's wider lives. And I don't think employers are particularly good at recognizing that we exist in a world that's much bigger than work. We need to design safe and supportive workplaces. The tourism industry has a very poor health and safety record overall. We need to work closely from an employer point of view with external stakeholders such as colleges, universities, and we need to see diversity not as a problem, but as an asset, as a huge virtue. And I think this is, again, something which can be neglected in discussion. And again, everything I talked about earlier on, the known knowns, if you like, are indicators of unsustainability and human resource management. And coming back to the pandemic, a lot of what happened in the short term went against these principles. They led to huge levels of job losses. They were represented in a lot of stop-start working opportunities in some countries that opened up, then closed down, opened up, closed down, with the workforce as a disposable asset within that process. And it was the vulnerable who were most affected: women, youth, students, disabled, minorities, migrant workers, workers in the informal sectors. What COVID has done is exposed intersections of disadvantage and exclusion, how they all come together. It's accelerated technology substitution, taking people out of tourism work. Therefore, there are less jobs. And in a country like your own in Brazil, where jobs, in a sense, are traditionally seen as a paramount requirement, especially for an industry like tourism, if we're automating, we're eliminating jobs. And what does that mean? The negative behavioral changes among consumers, as I mentioned, our evidence from research is that consumers have become much more aggressive and demanding. The uncertainty impacting on the long-term career aspirations, the traditional language, say, of tourism schools, for example, has been to start people on a career in tourism. Is that is that what you might call a contradiction in terms in this day and age? And we're seeing in many countries what we've called the post-pandemic recruitment crisis, a staffing crisis across the global north in the tourism industry. The industry just cannot attract people back into the workplace in the way that they would have done in the past. And that is provoking a lot of debate and a lot of discussion in this sort of area. So we're seeing tourism employment in crisis. We're seeing the direct effect through business closures, technology substitution, lack of consumer confidence, government restrictions in some respect. But we're also seeing indirect effects. People have found other things to do, other jobs to get, and we're seeing changing values to work. And I think in thinking about tourism, we need to understand that going back to the way things were in 2019 to early 2020 is not on the cards. We really need to think about work, and we need to think about models of work in tourism that are significantly different to the way they were before, and are far more balanced in terms of who wins from the transaction between the needs of the business and the needs of the workforce. So we've written, as I say, we've written on this subject, and in a sense, going forward, we have what we would call a chicken and egg situation. Which comes first in terms of the management people? Which comes first, the chicken or the egg in terms of change? Do we change the tourism industry to accommodate people, or do we change the people in order to accommodate the changing tourism industry? I don't know the answer to that. I don't think any of us do, really. So do we design jobs to reflect the workforce ecosystem, which I think we should do, or do we continue with the old model of designing work and then bringing people in and making them fit into it, as I said earlier? And the sustainable model then is really to create jobs in tourism that are based on our understanding of what people want from work, understanding people's reasons for coming into work every day. I always say to my students is, what is it that gets you out of bed in the morning and gets you on the bus to go into work or to come into university? What is it that drives that? And If employers don't understand that, they cannot create a sustainable future for work in that sense. And as researchers, there are so many conversations we need to have. We need to understand the nature of different models of tourism business, whether it's the micro businesses, family businesses in the informal sector, the gig sector. We need to understand the relationship between tourism and in-work poverty, particularly here in the global north, where there's evidence that people who work in tourism are far more likely to be at the poverty end of the wealth spectrum, if you like, than those who work in other sectors. We need to look at mental health issues in terms of tourism work, where there's, again, evidence of overrepresentation of people with mental health. We need to look at issues of abuse and sexual harassment in the workplace. We need to look at inclusion and this notion of disadvantage. I've just working with a colleague from New Zealand. I've just finished a piece on intersectionality. If you're familiar with the ideas behind the notion of intersectionality and how it applies to tourism employment. And what we find in tourism is that there are so many drivers of inequality and disadvantage, which all come together in the context of tourism work. We need to look at spatial and locational influences on tourism work, cost and availability of transport, of accessibility, of housing. We need to look at issues of employee voice and representation. We need to look at issues of the whole issue of consumer awareness and consumer responsibility for the working conditions of their countrymen, of the countries they're visiting, in terms of the work they do. Consumers are totally unaware of their responsibilities in this regard. And so we're left with many, many more questions than answers. I do believe this notion of sustainability is a conversation that we should be having. I'm not sure personally exactly where it will lead us and whether it will really provide answers, because I'm not sure that to some of the questions I always want to ask, I'm not sure that there are definitive answers. There are a number of things we need to be considering, exploring, but I'd really, at times, I think we need to learn to live with contradiction, to learn to live with paradox in this field. And if we are only looking for certain answers, for certain solutions, I think we'll continue to be frustrated. After all, a lot of the questions we're asking today were questions that were being asked many, many, many years ago, and where answers really haven't been found that actually allow us to effect meaningful change. So, thank you. I've said far too much this morning. I didn't expect to be speaking quite as long as I have, but I'm very, very happy to pick up questions from you now, to pick up questions indeed, using my email address there going forward in the future. Cecilia, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Tom. It was great hearing your presentation. You gave us a lot to think about. You raised a lot of good questions, difficult questions, and it was very insightful. I'm going to say in Portuguese to people to send the questions. Okay, right. The questions from the audience. I would like to ask a question myself. So you talked about how, from a global sustainability debate, prioritizes many times the environmental and the economic pillar, while the people pillar is neglected. Now, considering our situation here in Brazil, I can say that not even the environment aspect has gained attention and respect enough from our government, given that here, as I was telling you earlier this morning, people who dedicate their lives to the environment are killed, like happened this year, for example, with Bruno and Don Phillips, and like them, so many others. And considering what you call the people aspect and therefore working conditions, in 2017 we had a labor reform in Brazil that increased precarious job and also increased the number of unemployed people, which is more than 11 million people in our country today. And you've approached a few possible solutions for the problem of work. So, going towards decent work, you talked about sustainable human resource management and corporate social responsibility. I wonder if you consider any possible participation in the solution for the problem of precariousness with focus on the workforce. So I would like to ask, what is the role of workers, the employees themselves, in the fight for decent work in tourism?
That's a really good question. I think for me, the workers, in a sense, tourism from a community, if you look at tourism from a community point of view, the host community, and I think we always need to do that. Unless there is value, unless there is purpose to tourism for the community who host the tourists, there is no, the question then is, why are we doing this? What is the purpose of it? So it has to bring, I'm not saying the economic pillar, I'm not saying the environmental pillar are not important. Of course they are. In fact, those three pillars, in a sense, identifying them as three, in many ways doesn't make sense, because if we don't have a sustainable environment, we can't engage in economic activities and we can't benefit communities socially and culturally. So in a sense, they're all linked together. But I think the workforce, in a sense, must have a voice and must be the key deciders ultimately of what happens within the workplace. Because in a sense, the way our societies are constructed, work is central to what we do. It's central to identity. And in most societies, people who don't have work are in some ways excluded from a role in society. They are somehow outside of the economic and the social lives in which the rest of us exist. They're hugely disadvantaged. The majority of them are anyway. Of course, the question then is, when you've got a very, very large population who are currently not working, often disproportionately representing the young population, is any job better than no job? And the arguments I've heard from some sort of government politicians is that people should be happy with whatever job they get. It's better than not working at all. And at one level of economic survival, if you look at, say, traditional motivation theories, sure, that's true. At least you can put bread or rice on the table of your family if you have some sort of a job. But if that job lacks dignity and that job lacks respect in terms of yourself and your community, you have to beg its value. And it really is a difficult dilemma, this one of, is a job at any price worthwhile? And I'm not sure it is. Having said that, I'm not in a position where I have to make that decision. I think that the future of tourism and the work that takes place in tourism has to involve the workforce directly in the discussions that take place. If you look at it at a macro level, from a policy point of view, and I've looked at so many policy documents from tourist boards, from labour agencies, from governments, and from tourism industry organizations that are trying to sort of address employment and workforce issues for the tourism industry. They all come up with solutions and proposals and recommendations, which are generally always the same. They don't come up with anything new, and they just go around in circles. But they very, very, very rarely consult the employer voice. I mentioned our Fair Work Convention inquiry into hospitality here in Scotland. And what for me is unique in that process is that we have strong trade union and we have strong individual worker representation in that process. And for me, that's critical. Unless we actually engage people from the inside, who are employers, who are government officials, to decide what's good for tourism employment. They can't. They've got certain perspectives, but unless we have a multi-voice process that involves people in dialogue with each other over these issues, nothing will ever change. So I think, in a sense, but achieving this is very difficult because, again, I don't know the Brazilian situation, but in most countries in this part of the world, employer representation in tourism enterprises is very low. It's there within certain organized industries, the airline industry and travel, for example. But in the majority of tourism enterprises, there is either zero trade union representation, or it's very much a limited minority who have involvement. Interestingly, in this country, trade union representation in the hotel and hospitality industry has increased quite significantly as a result of the pandemic. The union voice has become somewhat louder, but it's still very much a minority. But just the quick answer is it's absolutely vital that employers understand the value of employee voice. It's absolutely vital that they actually start to listen to their workforce. And I think that is one of the routes to change, to their salvation, if you like.
Great, Tom. I was surprised to hear that in Scotland you have a lot of, you have strong workers trade union. This was one of the topics we discussed yesterday, because here in Brazil we have very low representation, especially in tourism. And like you, I agree, this is critical. I would like to hear more about that, but now I'm going to turn to the questions from the audience. And if we have time later, I'm going to ask you to come back to this topic if possible. So there's a question here from Liz. She's asking about the effectiveness of the 5 sustainability pillars mentioned in their 3 levels is only possible with engagement of the employer. The second part is how to convince him in the face of prioritization compared to prioritization of profit.
Yes, and that's a superb question. And this whole discussion, I have to be honest, when I talk about, if you like, sustainable approaches to employment and human resources, at some point, it is the whole argument depends on, if you like, your whole sense of values and ethical beliefs. And you have to make what I always call a leap of faith. You have to believe in the intrinsic value of people to a successful economic enterprise. Now, there is quite a lot of evidence, it's conflicting evidence, that the employers, not only in tourism, but the employers who generally, if you like, treat their employees well, actually are more successful in terms of their profitability. That there is, people have argued, and from a number of different angles, that if you treat your employees right, if you treat them fairly, that will create a more satisfied workforce, and that in turn will deliver better economic outcomes. And that's a nice argument. It makes me feel good if I think of that as being true. However, at the same time, there is evidence that actually that there are employers who treat their employees very, very badly and show increased profits each year. So the evidence is contradictory here. So the case is a very difficult one to make. I like to think we could make it on, if you like, moral grounds, ethical grounds. But I'm not sure that I'm convinced that will only persuade certain employers. Our Fair Work Convention in Scotland is based on the idea of selling the value of fair work, treating your employees fairly, not just in tourism, but in other sectors as well, as a way to running a better business and actually benefiting in terms of sustainable of keeping your employees, reducing your labor turnover, reducing your things like mental health issues in work, reducing health and safety issues, creating etc. But at the end of the day, I mean, that's a really key question. It does come down to persuading employers of the value of ethical behavior, and that is a difficult challenge.
Great. And I think this role that you are playing, raising this topic of fair work in Scotland, shows how the academy can fill a gap that is between what we discuss and practical life, right? Because many times we are discussing, we are critiquing, but we don't actually do something more effective. So it's really good to hear about that. There's another question here from Bianca. She's asking, Professor, what strategies could be used to how can I say this word? To make stronger the workers' union, since working in tourism is increasingly individualized.
That again is a good question. You're right that there are some trends and there are some arguments that that work generally has moved much more from the collective to the individual, and that really to survive, what we need to do is just to think of me, just look in the mirror and say what is good for me. I think there are examples. I don't know if you've heard of the Las Kellys movement in Spain, which is a group of housekeepers, hotel housekeepers, who have organized themselves to fight the case for their working conditions. And they've had ups and downs. It's been quite a battle, but I think if you're not familiar with it, for me, it's a hugely inspiring case of what can be done. It's also, for me, a case of individual agency in the leadership in trade unions. I mean, we here in Scotland, one of the largest UK trade unions, called Unite, has a hospitality branch. It's focused exclusively on hospitality, but the actors, the key activists in that group, are absolutely passionate individuals about the rights of individual workers. And I think you do need that sort of leadership, people who are willing to fight the case, to go to legal and sometimes paralegal means through strike action and the like, where the worst cases are in place. Likewise, Unite is interesting in the context of Ireland, where the leadership of Unite there now is in the hands of actually a migrant worker who was fired by her employer, by her restaurant, for trying to organize a trade union branch in that restaurant. And she then took it to the National Labour Court, won her case, and built her own, if you like, campaign for trade union recognition in the industry from that, and has done that very successfully. So in my experience, the win stories about worker representation in the tourism industry often come through individual agency, through individuals who are willing to take on that particular fight. Now, of course, there have to be the conditions that allow that to happen. There has to be, for example, the employment tribunal, labour court system that will allow that those sort of movements to flourish. The other side of the argument then is actually persuading employers that actually working collaboratively with a collective voice from the workforce is actually of value to them. It actually makes their job that much easier. It makes it less confrontational because they have a formal way of resolving issues. It's not just a case of a negative relationship. It's trying to build a positive relationship through trade union representation. So it's not only dealing with the bad, it's actually facilitating the common good, that if we work together, we actually create a more successful enterprise, which then benefits all of us. So in a sense, it's actually, again, it comes back to this argument about belief and faith in the good of people, that people actually, if they are allowed to participate and engage in the business, will actually take ownership of that responsibility, and the business will benefit as a result.
Professor, you mentioned the Las Kellys from Spain, right? Last year we had Professor Ernest Canhada. I don't know if you know, but he wrote a book in partnership with them, and he made his presentation here in our seminar. He's actually a partner of our research group. So I was very glad and surprised when you mentioned it. It's good that people are discussing what doing, because it's very inspirational, really, right?
It is absolutely. I don't know if it's absolutely inspirational. And if you think they are the work that they do as housekeepers in the hotel industry are some of the lowest and poorest paid in the industry in virtually every country. For them to have to really focus and to actually win the battles that they have won is, I fully agree, it's hugely inspirational.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about workers who do the cleaning in all areas these days, because they are very undervalued, anytime visible. But if they stop at some point, the whole world is going to stop, because we cannot live if any space is not clean. So I really think we should think about this and how important it is for them to be organized, because if workers are not organized, we can have other strategies. But as you said, many of the questions you raised have been raised many years ago, and until now, not much has changed, right? So the critical thing. So let me turn to the questions here. Edilene asked if more organization and workers union association wouldn't help reduce this, what is the opposite of equilibrium? I forgot the word
Make
for
it
that.
more unstable. Would it make it more unstable? Is that what you mean?
I think, to reduce the to make more, bring more balance. I think it's something you were discussing. So she asked at that moment if more organization on the side of workers and employees wouldn't help to reduce the inequality, something like this.
Inequalities, or I think Marianne has suggested imbalance. Certainly. It could do, I mean, it should do if it works appropriately. And I think we need to think of, I think employers are afraid of trade unions, for better or for worse. They have an image of trade unions as being exclusively negative in terms of their contribution, but that is not necessary. It doesn't necessarily need to be the case. I think there really is a case that trade unions need to present themselves as partners rather than as adversaries. So I think there's accommodation that needs to go in both directions. I think and trade unions need to promote themselves as organizations that can actually help employers, particularly larger employers, but not exclusively, actually overcome some of the problems they currently face. That there are, in a sense, you want it to be a win-win situation. And therefore, it isn't a case of trade unions just coming in for confrontational, for battle purposes. It is actually a collaborative process. But I think that can start at the top of industries. It can come at the top of countries, where what you would call a tripartite approach, where discussions are initiated by government, by employers, by trade unions, where there is equal voice in a process, which then is allowed to filter down to individual organizations. And that, again, can work. It can be a fairly successful model and can avoid some of the nastiest elements of confrontation. Because in a sense, if things are allowed to get to the point where they are purely confrontational, something has gone wrong in the relationship and the process.
Okay, and there's a question here from Maíra from our research group. She's asking, Professor, do you believe international documents, the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Global Goals, have any effectiveness raising environmental consciousness in the corporate sector, to companies? Was I clear?
Yes, yeah. That's not, I mean, I'm not, I can have my personal views on that. I don't really, it's not something where I would feel confident in terms of having evidence to support it one way or another. I think if you believe in the long-term effect of messaging and of images and of arguments, I suppose in time, if there is enough support for certain arguments, and I suppose we're talking in terms of this sort of question, we're talking about larger organizations. If over time, for example, an organization's stakeholders start to demand more ethical, more environmentally sustainable, more socially sustainable practices, corporations will need to respond to those messages. And we're starting to see some evidence, for example, in the oil and gas industry, that some organizations are doing that. We're seeing that in terms of some sort of investment funds, for example, who are where their membership are forcing them into more ethical choices in terms of where they invest. The problem with those arguments is we are talking about change over a very long period of time. And if you are sitting there looking for a job, desperate for a job to feed your family, and you're waiting for those changes to take place to allow that to happen, you're going to be waiting a long time, because change process in this area is frustratingly very, 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 very slow. And of course, that's what leads people, that's what leads environmental and social activists to direct action, because of the frustration of the slow change process. But as I say, I'm not an expert on this. I feel I'm speaking my own views here. I'm not really basing it on any sort of evidence that I've worked with.
Okay, I'm going to read now Mari's questions, and I think this can be our last question. She's asking, Professor, I would like you to talk a bit more about how to measure the level of sustainability in companies.
I suppose we're familiar. I think we're more familiar with, say, environmental indicators, corporate environmental indicators, in terms of their carbon footprint, in terms of their waste in disposal, in terms of their energy consumption, etc., etc. So that in those sort of areas, I suppose the indicators are reasonably, I'm not saying easy to establish, but there are established indicators which companies can use, or which can be used in relation to a company's activities. When we start to look at social indicators, it becomes more difficult. But I think there are some things. They might be economic. They might be the pay levels that the organization commits to. I mean, for example, here in the UK, we have a national minimum wage, which all employers are obligated to pay. But we also have what's called a living wage, which is significantly higher, which is deemed to be the minimum level at which people can reasonably sustain their livelihoods and that of their families. And many employers subscribe to a living wage, but that's not a compulsory thing. So I think if I was looking for sort of indicators of sustainability in relation to employment, I'd be looking to see whether that the organization was committed as a living wage employer. That would be a useful starting point. But even that doesn't cover everything else. I'd be looking at other indicators. What are the opportunities that are afforded to employees in terms of their advancement, in terms of their progression in the organization? What is the level of investment that the organization makes in broadly development activities for their workforce? You could look at external indicators in terms of how other stakeholders perceive the workforce, customer satisfaction to some extent, etc. There's a variety of indicators. None of them in themselves are really going to, if you like, completely close the loop. And I'm, if you like, from your question, I would say that there is a lot of work that we can usefully be doing to try to create measures of sustainability in terms of work and employment in the tourism indicators in industry that could take place. There's contributions that us as researchers can make, but there's also responsibility that needs to be taken by employers, and hopefully in collaboration with employer representatives, with trade unions as well. In themselves, indicators are only just that. They're only indicators. They don't necessarily in themselves create change, but they suggest that change is taking place. So they're useful, but they're not the solution in themselves. But it's something which all of us could collectively work on. And from an academic, from a researcher point of view, we could propose these indicators, and people have started to do that, and then try to sell their value to organizations and to bodies like hotel and tourism associations, which represent the industry at a national level.
Okay, Professor, I want to thank you so much for your time, for being here and sharing that with us. Do you want to say any last words?
No, as I said right in the beginning, we're on a mission. And one of the things we're doing is to try to create a manifesto, a collective manifesto about what is good work, what is decent work in the tourism sector. If anybody is interested in participating in that process, in giving us voices from Brazil, we would be really very, very happy to hear from you. And I'd pass your name straight on to my colleague who is organizing that. If there's any other questions any of you have, if there's anything you want to share or want to discuss or want to participate in, we're very, very open. We're a very loose network of researchers interested in this area across a number of countries. We're very welcoming of as many other people who want to join in our commitment to this area. So we would be very, very happy to hear from any of you.
Fantastic. Fantastic, Professor. Thank you so much. I can say that we at our research group, we are interested in participate in this manifesto. We are going to talk to you about that. And I'm just going to tell everybody about the other activity, ok? Just a moment. Então, gente, a gente tem a próxima atividade agora às 10. E obrigada a todos e todas e todes que participaram. Thank you so much, Tom. And we hope to see you someday in a lecture here in our country. It would be a pleasure to continue sharing with you. Okay, so thank you so much. And that's it, guys. See you guys.
Thank you very much. Have a very good remainder of your meeting. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye.